Unfortunately, there are no more secular entries in the Visigothic legal code, nor have the minutes of other church councils survived. Egica died probably in 702, and his son Witiza reigned onward until his own death in 710. What we know of him is precious little. The closest contemporary source is the Chronicle of 754, which was authored by an anonymous Christian cleric living in Spain a few decades after the initial Muslim invasion. The next closest source is the Chronicle of Alfonso III, which was written in northern Spain under the Christian Asturian dynasty. This text, however, was written in the 10th century, some 200 years after the events surrounding the initial downfall of Visigothic Spain. The Chronicle of 754, in reference to Witiza, says that, quote, "Although he succeeded to his father's throne petulantly, Witiza was most clement during the 15 years that he remained in the kingship. He not only brought back to favor those whom his father had condemned to exile, but he did them service when they were restored. Indeed, Witiza brought back to their former joy those whom his father had oppressed with a heavy yoke, and he freely gave land back to those who had been deprived of it by his father. Finally, he called everyone together and publicly and formally burned the pledges that his father had enacted by trickery. Not only did he release the innocent from, if you like, their unbreakable bonds, but he also returned from his own property that which had long been alienated from the fisc, restoring it to the public domain." Unquote. If Requeswint had reversed the pro-Jewish policies of his father, Kindeswint, it seems that Witiza reversed the anti-Jewish policies of his father, Egica. This would fall into the same pattern of pro-Jewish, anti-Jewish vacillation of the previous century. While the text does not name the Jews specifically within this tract, its broad language may refer to them nonetheless in places such as the line, "Release the innocent from their unbreakable bonds." The notion that Witiza sought the support of the Jews is also attested to by the Chronicle of Lucas de Tuy, although it should be noted that Lucas was writing in the 13th century, and several scholars have voiced concerns over his trustworthiness. Bernard Bachrach acknowledges and addresses these concerns. Quote, "The two most damaging attacks on the evidence Lucas provides are based on his long separation in time from the events themselves and on the alleged enmity of the church toward Witiza. It is true that Lucas portrays Witiza as a bad king. In doing so, however, he was merely following a well-established historiographical tradition. He passed on the picture that he found in his sources and added the fact that Witiza pursued a pro-Jewish policy. In defense of Lucas, it should be noted that his chronicle is an uncritical grab bag of facts, stories, and legends gleaned from numerous written and oral sources. That Lucas personally shared in the Kirchliche Feindschaft, which is alleged to have motivated Witiza's bad press, has not been proven. Yet, even if it were demonstrated that Lucas shared this bias, it would not in itself constitute proof that he or his source fabricated the story of Witiza's pro-Jewish policy." Unquote. The Chronicle of 754 and the later Chronicle of Alfonso are at odds with each other in terms of how they portray Witiza. The former states that Witiza ruled prosperously, and that everyone in Spain, confident in their great joy, eagerly rejoiced. The Alfonso text calls Witiza, however, a reprobate who ruined Spain. Nevertheless, at times the two texts may possibly confirm each other in subtle ways. For example, the Chronicle of Alfonso says that Witiza, quote, "dissolved the councils, he sealed the canons, he took many wives and concubines, and to prevent any council from being convened against him, he ordered the bishops, priests, and deacons to take wives. This, then, was the cause of Spain's ruin." Unquote. While the Chronicle of 754 does not mirror this perfectly, it does say that Witiza, together with a certain bishop, Sindared, continually instigated and vexed the church officials. Thus it seems fairly certain that Witiza had done something to anger the church. Various sources have indicated that, indeed, there was an 18th church council under Witiza, and some scholars believe it entirely possible that its acts were deliberately suppressed due to their controversial nature. The Chronicle of 754 says that in 711, a Visigothic noble named Roderick, quote, "rebelliously seized the kingdom of the Goths at the instigation of the Senate." Unquote. This somewhat undermines its earlier claim that everyone in Spain rejoiced under Witiza's rule, and reaffirms the Alfonso Chronicle's assertion that Witiza was a despised king. Moreover, it may suggest armed conflict, whereby Witiza was killed. Witiza was most likely still in his mid-20s at the time, and while the text does not specify that he was killed, he's never heard from again. Perhaps the author skirted over the details, just as Isidore Seville had done with Recared II's demise. The Chronicle of Alfonso, however, claims outright that Witiza died a natural death in Toledo, and that Roderick was elected king by the Goths. As it turns out, Witiza dying in his mid-20s may not be entirely indicative of foul play. The Chronicle of 754 mentions that he and his father had to vacate the palace in 701 due to an outbreak of plague, and numerous documents speak of outbreaks during the previous century. Perhaps Witiza simply died from plague later on. Whether or not he was killed, virtually everyone concurs that what followed the end of his reign was a civil war, but this is where the agreement ends. The only hard evidence from the period are minted coins. Some bear the name Roderick and indicate a realm within Toledo and Egatania. Others bear the name Aquila and indicate a realm within Narbonne, Gerona, Tarragona, and Saragossa. Thus, it's reasonable to assume that Roderick ruled in the southwest, while someone else, named Aquila, ruled in the northeast. What's odd, though, is that none of the texts mention Aquila by name, only Roderick. The Chronicle of 754 states that around this same time, Arab and Moorish forces led by Tariq ibn Ziyad had been engaging in a series of raids in the south. In response, Roderick mustered forces to face this new threat in battle, where the Chronicle states that, quote, the entire army of the Goths, which had come with him fraudulently and in rivalry out of ambition for the kingship, fled, and he was killed. Thus Roderick wretchedly lost not only his rule, but his homeland, his rivals also being killed, as Walid was completing his 6th year of rule, unquote. The text goes on to describe the continued conquest of Musa ibn Nuzair. Quote, after forcing his way up to Toledo, the royal city, he imposed on the adjacent regions an evil and fraudulent peace. He decapitated on a scaffold those noble lords who still remained, arresting them in flight from Toledo with the help of Oppa, King Egaca's son. With Oppa's support, he killed them all with the sword. He devastated not only Hispania Ulterior, but Hispania Quiterior, up to and beyond the ancient and once flourishing city of Saragossa, which was now, by the judgment of God, openly exposed to the sword, famine, and captivity. He ruined beautiful cities, burning them with fire, condemned lords and powerful men to the cross, and butchered youths and infants with swords, unquote. This is Kenneth Wolf's translation, however. Other translations and historians do not agree on the line concerning Oppa. Edward Thompson, for example, translated it to mean that Musa in fact murdered Oppa along with all the other Gothic nobles. Thompson says that, quote, Musa himself soon crossed to Spain, where civil war was now raging among the Goths, though the identity of the leaders on each side is unknown. He managed to enter Toledo and put to death, among others, Oppa, a son of Egaca and brother of Witiza, and he then advanced to beyond Saragossa, though it was at Cordoba that he established his headquarters, unquote. As Collins points out, this passage may have been corrupted. Quote, an equally difficult and possibly corrupt passage records how the Arab and Berber forces under the command of Musa took Toledo in 711, and how this was followed by the execution of various noble lords who were still in the city on the pretext of their being involved in the flight of Oppa, a son of King Egaca, unquote. Collins' perspective here is that the nobles may have been executed for helping Oppa escape, which is entirely different from Thompson's take that Oppa was murdered. Bachrach is convinced that Oppa was the Archbishop of Seville and Aquila's uncle. He states that Roderick was campaigning against the Basques when, quote, an army led by Tariq ibn Ziyad landed in the south of Spain. Roderick gathered a large force, including contingents led by Aquila's supporters, Archbishop Oppas of Seville, and a noble named Sisibert. When Tariq's forces met Roderick's army near the lake of La Honda in southern Spain on either the 25th or 26th of July, those fighting men and magnates loyal to Aquila deserted, and the Muslims won a decisive victory. During the next 3 years, the Muslims subdued Roderick's kingdom. The Jews opposed Roderick's supporters and allied with the Muslims, unquote. The Chronicle of Alfonso states the following regarding the invasion. Quote, after Witiza died, Roderick was anointed as king. In his time, Spain grew even worse in its iniquity. In the 3rd year of his rule, the Saracens entered Spain on account of the treachery of the sons of Witiza. When the king became aware of their invasion, he immediately went out with his army to fight against them. But, weighed down by the quantity of their sins and exposed by the treachery of the sons of Witiza, the Goths were put to flight. The army, fleeing to its destruction, was almost annihilated. Because they forsook the Lord and did not serve him in justice and truth, they were forsaken by the Lord, so that they could no longer inhabit the land that they desired, unquote. There are several things to note here. The author directly contradicts the 754 text, which claims that Roderick only ruled for a year. He thereby places the end of Roderick's reign and Tariq's invasion in the year 714. Visigothic coinage does not support these dates, and suggests that Roderick's reign began in 710 and ended in 711. In the Rotense version of the Alfonso text, that is, the one I just quoted, the author doesn't go into any detail about how Witiza's sons betrayed the Visigoths. Yet, in the later Ad Sebastian version, the author leaves far less to the imagination and states outright that Witiza's sons, quote, possessed by envy because Roderick had occupied their father's throne, they cleverly sent emissaries to Africa to ask the Arabs for help, and they provided them with ships with which the Arabs were introduced into Spain, unquote. Although both versions were probably written around the same time, it's generally thought that the Bishop of Salamanca, Sebastian, upon receiving a copy of the text from his uncle, the king, felt it appropriate to flesh out more details. While the Chronicle of 754 may indeed name Oppa as a traitor, a major problem with either version of the Chronicle of Alfonso is that they both refer to Oppa as the son of Witiza, not Egica. Any son of Witiza, however, would have been a child still in 712, since Witiza was probably born in 688, if Quixilo was indeed his mother, as the Alfonso text claims. Assuming that Witiza was able to impregnate a woman when he was 13, that would make Oppa about 10 when Muslim forces invaded Toledo. It seems far more likely that Oppa was Witiza's brother, as the 754 Chronicle claims. As Collins said, the narrative in the Alfonso text is, quote, totally self-contradictory. It's also not entirely unreasonable to suspect that there was more than one historical figure named Oppa, and that the chronicles simply confused them. As Collins says, quote, that Oppa cannot be both a son of Witiza and a son of Egica, a lay lord and a possible royal claimant, and also Bishop of Toledo or Seville, must also be accepted. There may have been a Bishop of Seville of this name at about the same time, as testified in an episcopal list preserved in a late 10th century manuscript. That Oppa could not be a son of Witiza can also be shown. In any case, priority has to be given to the account of the Chronicle of 754 over the Alphonsine one, as it is so much closer in date. In fact, it looks as if the Oppa of the Chronicle of Alfonso III derives from a garbled or poorly transmitted version of the events that are independently recorded in the 754 Chronicle, but with some deliberate recasting and revision of them, intended to promote the ideological program of the Asturian monarchy, unquote. Regarding the betrayal of Roderick, here's Kenneth Wolf's translation again of the pertinent lines in the Chronicle of 754. Quote, Roderick headed for the Transductine Mountains to fight them, and in that battle, the entire army of the Goths, which had come with him fraudulently and in rivalry out of ambition for the kingship, fled, and he was killed. Thus, Roderick wretchedly lost not only his rule, but his homeland, his rivals also being killed, as Walid was completing his 6th year of rule, unquote. Now, here is a different translation by another scholar, Colin Smith. Quote, Roderick met and joined battle with them, and he was killed in the fight together with the entire Gothic army as it fled, those who had supported him as he treacherously sought to win the crown. In this way, Roderick lost both the crown and his realm in the general destruction caused by rivalries, unquote. Now, most scholars concur with Wolf's translation, but a reflexive verb in the first clause may actually indicate that Roderick himself was indeed fleeing alongside the army. Also note that the original text, without any doubt, says that the entire Gothic army fled, not a portion of it. It also does not name any traitors, nor does it use such a word to describe the rivals. While subsequent chronicles are often ready to blame Witiza's sons, the 754 text doesn't even mention them. If anything, it's quite benevolent toward their father, while it retains an otherwise harsh tone toward Roderick, who is seen as someone who tumultuously invaded Toledo and who wretchedly lost not only his rule but his homeland. Roderick's ambition for the throne might be seen here as the focal point rather than the fleeing army. While I don't think this entirely dissolves the notion of betrayal, it's fitting that the Chronicle of 754 later says, quote, who can relate such perils? Who can enumerate such grievous disasters? Even if every limb were transformed into a tongue, it would be beyond human capability to express the ruin of Spain and its many and great evils, unquote. The conquest happened so fast that it's likely that no one was able to properly record it, not even the Muslims, as I will shortly attempt to address. This was an age when people had to copy entire books by hand with feather pens. There would have been utter chaos as the kingdom's government collapsed in a matter of weeks and months. The temptation for subsequent Latin and Arab writers to fill in the gaps may have been substantial. The Arab sources, to my knowledge, never make any mention of Oppa, although several of them do focus on the sons of Witiza and their alleged betrayal of Roderick. But even those don't mirror the Alfonso Chronicles scenario of Witiza's sons supplying the Arab invaders with ships. That is typically ascribed to a Byzantine governor in North Africa, who assisted them after Roderick supposedly violated his daughter at the royal court. I'll discuss that in a moment, but for now, it must be stressed here again that all the evidence strongly suggests that Witiza's sons were still children in 711. Indeed, the Arab sources conflict on this very fact as well. Some of them claim that upon Witiza's death, his wife ruled for a time due to his son's tender years, but that Roderick refused to accept her rule and invaded Toledo. Other Arab sources contend that Witiza's sons commanded the very armies that were sent to assist Roderick against the invaders. One even goes so far as to claim that Roderick wrote them a letter petitioning their help despite his persecution of their family, apparently cautioning them against the danger of private feuds. As the account goes, the sons initially agreed, but later connived behind his back with Tariq, right before the battle that was to decide the fate of Spain. They apparently told Tariq that they would abandon Roderick in battle if he would help restore them to their father's throne. What immediately stands out about that account is that it contradicts the Alfonso Chronicles' claim that Witiza's sons had sent emissaries to Africa, let alone that they gave Tariq ships. Roderick is also referred to by name, whereas Witiza's sons are just repeatedly referred to generically as Witiza's sons. Moreover, Roderick places them at the head of the right and left wings of his army. Even if Roderick was desperate for their help, it seems quite doubtful that after he had killed their father, stolen their property, and usurped the throne, that he would then place them in such positions where they could inflict massive harm on him. Putting that aside, the general problems of the Arab sources are summed up best by Roger Collins, who says the following, quote, "To a large degree, the problem is one of contradictions and confusion in the sources, resulting not least from the character of much of the Arab historiography of the Western conquests. Thus, the Arab historians, writing in Egypt, North Africa, and Spain from the later 9th century onward, often worked backward from contemporary conditions and practices, and tried to find an explanation for their existence in terms of what had happened in the past." Unquote. Now, with this in mind, some of the Arab accounts get exceedingly absurd in their soothsaying elements. For example, against the warnings of his advisors and courtiers, Roderick is said to have broken into an enchanted palace, containing, among other things, King Solomon's table. Within the palace, he finds and opens a magic scroll that releases a curse upon himself and the kingdom. The curse read, quote, "Whenever this asylum is violated, and the spell contained in this urn broken, the people painted on this urn shall invade Andalus, overturn the throne of its kings, and subdue the whole country." Unquote. Naturally, the people painted on the scroll were Arabs, and upon seeing the Arab forces at the Battle of Guadalete, Roderick is reported to have cried out in horror. Since these were the same people from the scroll, he now knew that he was doomed. Not that I believe the Arab sources have no historical value, but it is difficult to discern where perceived fact ends and where overt fantasy begins. One of the most audacious claims by the Arab sources is that Roderick had an army of 100,000 men, whereas the Muslims had only 12,000. Even were this the case, it would perhaps make the notion of any Visigothic pact with the Muslim forces even more ludicrous, depending on how those forces were split between Witiza's sons and Roderick. If Roderick had the bulk of those forces, then abandoning him in battle would make little difference. If the forces were mostly on the side of Witiza's sons, then they would have no need to bargain with foreigners whom their grandfather had likely been warring against. If the forces were split fairly evenly, thereby creating an incentive for Witiza's sons to use Tariq's forces against Roderick's, then Tariq's forces would still be massively outnumbered by Roderick's contingency by about 4 to 1. Recall that the Visigoths had sacked Rome several times, and had repelled Byzantine invasions as well. These were not weak men, and even the best armies in the world would have had a difficult time defeating them on an equal playing field. Very frequently, the Arab sources also give focus to a man named Julian, who was the alleged governor of Ceuta, a Byzantine outpost on the North African coast south of Spain. As the general story goes, Julian had sent his daughter to King Roderick's court, where she was violated in some way, and in retaliation, Julian gave the Arabs a fleet of ships to sail across the strait. On the historical character of Julian, Roger Collins says, quote, "In reality, both father and daughter are fictional creations, who belong to a set of moralizing traditions intended to make sense of the catastrophe that so rapidly overcame the Visigothic kingdom, by means of a simple drama of human passions. As for the Arabs needing Julian's ships to make the very short crossing to Spain, it has to be asked how they had been able to raid so extensively virtually all of the islands in the western Mediterranean in the course of the same decade." Unquote. Keeping this in mind, 19th century Spanish historian Rafael Altamira gives a good summary of a more popular synthesis of the Arab sources concerning Julian's role. Quote, "Julian was a Byzantine governor of Ceuta and received assistance from Witiza in 708 when his city was attacked by the Muslims, and was therefore bound to the Visigothic king by ties of gratitude and possibly of self-interest. On the death of Witiza, when Julian was attacked again by the Arabs, he surrendered to them on condition that, during his lifetime, he might continue to hold the city of Ceuta under the supreme authority of the caliph. When Attila was deposed by Roderick, he sought help from Julian, who helped him by making a preliminary expedition to Spain, which was not successful. Then the family of Witiza had recourse to the Muslim chiefs, who were more powerful than Julian, and after long negotiations, thanks to his intervention, they succeeded in obtaining the support of the Arab troops of Africa, and thus managed to defeat Roderick." Unquote. Again, this assumes that Attila was Witiza's son, who would have been extremely young at the time. To explain his young age, it's been asserted that Attila was granted the northeastern provinces under the guidance of a dignitary. The pieces do curiously fit to a degree. Witiza would have been following the example of his father, Egica, who had made him co-ruler as a child. This might also explain why the earlier texts don't mention Attila by name, as he wouldn't have been old enough to be a real political player. Likewise, the typical response to a king associating his son with the kingship was rebellion upon his death. Yet the royal currency from the period indicates that Aquila's reign began after Witiza's, not during, and unlike the coins minted under Egica and Witiza, none of Aquila's coins suggest co-regency with his father. Also, from what I've read, none of the Arab chronicles that name Witiza's sons ever list Aquila as one of them. Pascual de Gallangos, another Spanish historian and Arabist, also contends that there is no historical evidence of Witiza ever having sent troops to Africa, and that the author of the Arab source who says so may have been attributing the actions of Witiza's father, Egica, to Witiza himself. During his reign, Egica, according to other Arab and Latin writers, had dispatched Theodemir, a Visigothic general, with a fleet to ravage the Mohammedan settlements along the coast of northern Africa. Theodemir is likewise recorded by the Chronicle of 754 as having put up prolonged resistance against the Muslim invaders before eventually negotiating peace terms. The evidence seen from this angle makes the notion of an alliance between Witiza's faction and the Muslims very doubtful. If anything, it suggests that Witiza's family would have been hated by them, and lends more credence to Thompson's translation of the pertinent lines in the Chronicle of 754 that Musa probably killed the Gothic nobles in Toledo for having allowed Oppa, Witiza's brother, to flee the city. I suspect that the Jewish apologists by now will have seized upon the notion that Egica's grandchildren betrayed the Visigoths to the Muslims, and gleefully exclaim that Egica's fears at the 17th Council of Toledo were mere projections of his own treasonous disposition that would later manifest itself into action against his own people. Admittedly, the behavior of the Visigothic refugi during the 7th century does lend some credence to the idea that Witiza's family could have sought aid from Julian of Ceuta, who in turn brokered a deal with his Muslim overlords. Perhaps the strongest evidence against these stories, however, is that there's no real explanation as to how or why Tariq and Musa didn't hold up their end of the bargain. Witiza's sons were obviously not restored to the throne, and even Aquila's territory fell shortly afterwards. Curiously, if there is one thing that the Arab sources are consistent about, it's that the defenses of numerous cities were handed over to Jewish locals after their initial conquest. Gallangos informs us, quote, "The practice, so universally observed by the invaders, of entrusting to the Jews the defense of the cities and fortresses taken from the Christians, would, in the absence of any other fact, show that a previous understanding must have existed long between them and the Berbers under the orders of Tariq. and that the discontent or the ambition of Julian, the wrongs done to the sons of Witiza, and the troubled state of the Gothic monarchy were not the only causes of the conquest of Spain. That the Jews of the peninsula had at different times been suspected of holding communication with those of Africa, that in the reign of Egeka they had actually been accused, and to all appearances convicted, of inviting the Arabs to make a conquest of Spain, is sufficiently attested by the national writers. I have shown elsewhere on the authority of Ibn Khaldun that most of the Berber tribes inhabiting the northern shores of Africa professed the Jewish religion. And although we are told that the 12,000 men which Musa placed under the orders of Tariq had previously been converted to the Mohammedan faith and duly instructed in all the duties of their new religion by theologians appointed for that purpose, there is every reason to suppose that their conversion was neither so sudden nor so sincere as to blot out immediately all recollection of their former habits and religious ceremonies, and that they felt great sympathy for their former brethren. Hence, on the invasion of Spain by the Berbers, the Jews, who expected to be delivered by them from the state of oppression in which they lived, everywhere made common cause with them." Unquote. While the downfall of Spain cannot and should not be entirely attributed to Jewish elements, they were certainly a factor. Prior to World War II, virtually all academics, Jewish and Gentile alike, were in agreement on this. The 1906 Jewish Encyclopedia states that it is, quote, "a fact that the Jews either directly or through their co-religionists in Africa encouraged the Mohammedans to conquer Spain, and that they greeted them as their deliverers." After the Battle of Jerez, in which African Jews fought bravely under Kaul al-Yahudi, and in which the last Gothic king Roderick and his nobles were slain, the conquerors Musa and Tariq were everywhere victorious. Unquote. 19th century Jewish historian Heinrich Reitz claimed that, quote, "the Jews of Africa, who at various times had emigrated thither from Spain, and their unlucky co-religionists of the peninsula, made common cause with the Mohammedan conqueror Tariq, who brought over from Africa into Andalusia an army eager for the fray. After the Battle of Jerez and the death of Roderick, the last of the Visigothic kings, the victorious Arabs pushed onward and were everywhere supported by the Jews. In every city that they conquered, the Muslim generals were able to leave but a small garrison of their own troops, as they had need of every man for the subjection of the country. They therefore confided them to the safekeeping of the Jews. In this manner, the Jews, who but lately had been serfs, now became the masters of the towns of Cordoba, Granada, Malaga, and many others. When Tariq appeared before the capital Toledo, he found it occupied by a small garrison only, the nobles and clergy having found safety in flight. While the Christians were in church, praying for the safety of their country and religion, the Jews flung open the gates to the victorious Arabs, receiving them with acclamations, and thus avenged themselves for the many miseries which had befallen them in the course of a century since the time of Recared and Sisebut. The capital also was entrusted by Tariq to the custody of the Jews, while he pushed on in pursuit of the cowardly Visigoths, who had sought safety in flight for the purpose of recovering from them the treasure which they had carried off." Unquote. What Graetz is referencing here, among other things, is Lucas de Toy's account, which records that in the year that the Moors invaded, the Catholic inhabitants of Toledo left the protection of their walls on Palm Sunday and went to the Holy Church of St. Leocadia to listen to the divine sermon. According to Lucas, the Jews informed the Muslims of this, and then they closed the gates of the city before the Catholics could return and open them for the invaders. While this may very well be an embellishment or distortion of the facts, I will say that if we are going to take 16th century Jewish accounts seriously, as does Solomon Katz, then we should also take 12th century Catholic accounts seriously. Speaking of Solomon Katz, in 1936 he didn't deny Jewish involvement, but rather justified it. Quote, "Driven to desperation, the Jews, both baptized and non-baptized, asked aid from their brethren in Africa and made plans to deliver Spain to the more tolerant Moors. The plot was discovered in time, and Egeka immediately called the 17th Council, and before it related the crime against the state. He demanded that measures be taken against all, even baptized Jews. Only those of Septimania, dwelling in the mountain passes and necessary for the protection of that province, were exempt from his laws, on condition that they become Christians. All others were declared slaves, their goods were confiscated, and they themselves scattered in the various provinces. They were assigned to Christian masters, who had to swear never to free them. These masters had to guard against any observance of the Jewish rites by their newly acquired slaves. Jewish children were to be removed from the home of their parents at the age of 7 and sent to Christian schools and later married to Christians. These measures were sanctioned by the king. A number of Jews escaped in time. The others were reduced to slavery. Witiza would probably not have freed the Jews from these unparalleled oppressions. Under his successor, however, the Jews were revenged. When in 711 the Arabs invaded Spain, they are said to have found in each city a faithful band of Jews to welcome them and to help them. 2 centuries of ruthless persecution had ended for the Jews." Unquote. After the end of World War II, there seems to have been a shift towards downplaying and minimizing the Jewish role in the invasion. Norman Roth has an interesting paper with this aim. He makes some good points, but overall fails to convince. He attempts to undermine the evidence that Jewish troops from Africa fought in the invasion. He questions how many of the Berber tribes at the time were Jewish, and he also says that Toledo was in fact abandoned when Tariq showed up, and therefore the Palm Sunday story must be a myth. There is an Arab source that claims Tariq found Toledo deserted, but it's somewhat contradictory in that it also claims that afterwards Tariq gathered the city's Jews before continuing his pursuit of the Goths. Obviously, the city wasn't deserted by Jews, and that probably says something in and of itself. I don't have access to the original text attributed to the 11th century scholar Ibn Hayyan, but considering al-Makari's description, it seems somewhat in line with the Chronicle of 754's assertion that not all, but many of the Gothic nobles and clerics had fled the city. Perhaps deserted here simply refers to the city's main defenses and aristocracy. The Chronicle of 754 clearly states that there was a massacre of noble men. While the Arab sources do have many issues, I think the consistency of the non-central role they typically ascribe to the Jews in the previous century of Judeo-Christian hostilities rendered them credible in this regard. Egeka had accused the Jews of plotting against Spain, and they even signed a confession admitting as much. Although the 754 Chronicle tells us that Egeka used trickery to get various people to sign false documents, and this may include the Jewish confessions. But this would fall into the same previous pattern of Gothic vacillation on Jewish policies, and therefore may represent more evidence that Witiza did in fact pardon the Jews. This in turn may have upset some of the clerics and nobles, who then encouraged Roderick to invade Toledo when Witiza died. Perhaps this is why everyone seems to have hated Witiza in later years and were ready to blame his family for all of Spain's ills. Whatever the case, the Jews had clear motive, opportunity, and ability to seek foreign invasion. They had precedent in supporting rebellions in and outside of Spain. They were also well-connected merchants, slavers, and bankers. They would have had intimate knowledge of the inner workings of the state, its defenses, its resources, and so on. This might help explain how the Arabs and Moors so quickly conquered a region and people who had been able to continually repel Byzantine invasions. In any event, the Jewish role in the conquest is credible, even coming from the Arab sources, because it is never described via endlessly contradictory accounts. The accusation is straightforward and consistent. The Jews suffered under the Goths, and thus encouraged invasion. Then, when it arrived, they supported it. If Nathan Roth wants to cling to the idea that none of the invading Berbers were Jewish, that's fine, and I'm willing to grant him that. I'm not entirely convinced that Lucas de Tuy made up his story about Palm Sunday, but if it makes anyone feel better, I'll concede that as well. The fact that the Jews were entrusted to hold the territory for the invading armies says enough on its own. Notice how many of the Jewish authors prior to World War II described the invasion as revenge. Judaism is many things, but it's never been eager to forgive its enemies. The tract of the Talmud that deals with Jesus boiling an excrement addresses numerous historical figures who had all wronged the Jews in one way or another, and explains in detail what their punishments were to be after death. Now, as for the exact details of the invasion, we will likely never know. The Visigothic kingdom was already in decay. It had suffered numerous outbreaks of plague, internal rebellions, Byzantine invasions, and even a cooling period that contributed to crop failure and famine. It should be stressed that had the Jews not been a factor in Spain, the Muslims may have invaded regardless, and even if they didn't, the Byzantines might have tried again. If neither of these, then certainly the Basques or the Franks would have caused more problems. Regardless, diversity was not Visigothic Spain's strength, and it is reasonable to assume that had the Jews not been present in Spain at the time, the Visigothic kingdom might not have been conquered, as the Muslims would not have had a homegrown support group. Unfortunately, it was beyond the scope of this series to address the supposed Judeo-Islamic Golden Age that followed the Arab conquest. Hopefully, though, I've convinced some people that Jewish behavior contributed to their own persecution under the Visigoths, or at the very least, that they were not tolerant bystanders just minding their own business. Most of the anti-Jewish laws had a Jewish counterpart. Jews did not allow interfaith marriages, nor did they approve of Jews being enslaved by or working for Christians. In addition to cases of Christians forcibly baptizing Jews, there were recorded instances of Jews forcibly circumcising Christian slaves. While the Jews were taxed punitively toward the end of the century, usury of non-Jews had historically been a religiously sanctioned practice of Judaism. Hostility toward the Jews increased exponentially as it became apparent that they had no intention of respecting initially reasonable Christian requests. The point from which many scholars assert that interfaith relations deteriorated was when Recared decreed that Jews could no longer own Christian slaves. The Jews ignored the law, probably because their economy heavily depended on Christian slave labor. Thenceforth, a cat-and-mouse game ensued, with the Jews bribing the worst elements of society so that they might carry on business as usual. In response, the Christians made increasingly confused and seemingly incoherent laws in vain attempts to address this. Eventually, the situation culminated with the Catholics seeking either the conversion or the departure of the Jews. The Jews responded by plotting to overthrow the kingdom entirely. Agagha enslaved them. Witiza perhaps freed them. The Muslims invaded. The Jews supported them, probably because they figured it was only a matter of time before new leadership would persecute them again. The Visigoths, divided internally, were driven from their lands. Many who could not escape were slaughtered. Those who survived had to live under demi-status, and were often bought and sold as slaves in the following years by the very same Jews who had been persecuted prior. On the nature of the conquest, Pascual de Gayangos wrote that, quote, "Populous towns were not unfrequently razed to the ground, and their inhabitants, amounting to several thousands, led into captivity," unquote. Now, one important facet of the persecution of the Jews was that while the Catholics wanted them to assimilate, the Jews wanted to remain separate. As the 19th century French scholar Ernest Renan once said, quote, "A nation never has any real interest in annexing or holding on to a subdivision against its will," unquote. Yet the Jews of Spain were not seeking traditional sovereignty as one normally understands it, but rather unrestricted, unqualified access to Gentile society for the purposes of exploitation. The Visigoths and the Catholics were under no obligation to respect or tolerate this. Moreover, had the Jews been mostly recluse, or had they respected the religious boundaries of Christians, there is no real indication that they would have been so fervently targeted. Again, what stands out about the Visigoths is that they tolerated hostile Jewish behavior for a very long time before they made any serious attempt to address it. And what's more is that when they did, the Jews sought vengeance against them, more or less, for having attempted to defend themselves. Now, to a very real extent, I would argue that the ancient war between the Greco-Romans and the Jews never really ended, but rather it broadened in scope to include Visigothic Spain and Byzantium. To one degree or another, the Jews believed, and still believe to this day, that they are to inherit all the nations of the world, and that they are supposed to be a priestly class to all of humanity. Yet, almost everywhere the Jews have gone in Europe, they've eventually been expelled, almost without exception. This is not because of some irrational, baseless hatred. It's because, at their core, the Jews are moral particularists, whereas Europeans are moral universalists. Not only does this make us fundamentally incompatible, but it also makes any dialogue of reconciliation virtually impossible, unless it is done in an utterly submissive manner in Jewish favor. The Jews will not admit to any transgression, and perhaps this is because they are unable to understand how they've harmed anyone. Or perhaps they are able to do so, but simply prefer not to. Either way, admitting to transgressions would nullify the strategy of victimhood, which, not coincidentally, only works on Europeans.